All right, well, it's my first time hosting the show. We've got William here with us, our chief operating officer, and hopefully he doesn't have a panic attack with anything that I might say that might get us into some trouble here.
No, I have absolute confidence in your ability to stay on message and our ability to do editing.
Perfect, absolutely right. And Sue-Ann, where are you coming into? Where are you beaming into for this episode?
I'm beaming in from planet Florida, and I'm back in Toronto in 2 weeks. And I have to tell you guys that it has been like a different world down here. God bless Ron DeSantis. He is not allowing any sort of protesting, no free Palestine flags or banners, no blatant acts of anti-Semitism. There are a few masks, although, I've seen people in masks, mostly New Yorkers, I would say.
Maybe a few snowbirds as well who brought down their Canadian values to Florida with some masks.
Yeah, but I would say mostly New Yorkers. I want to go up to them and say, 2020 is calling. They want you back.
They stand out like a sore thumb, I guess. Yeah. All right, guys, with that, let's get into it. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Off the Record. I am Harrison Faulkner. We are joined by the True North Chief Operating Officer, William McBeath, and True North journalist, Sue-Ann Levy. Guys, how's everyone's week been?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, we had snow here in Calgary earlier today, so I'm definitely envious of Sue-Ann right now.
And it's 80 plus here.
Unfair.
Well, let's get into this first story right away. It's about Jagmeet Singh, and he has some rather unfounded optimism about his chances in the next upcoming federal election. Take a look at this article that we wrote here. Jagmeet Singh, guys, he genuinely believes that he will win the next federal election. We're going to throw to this clip here, and it kind of explains a little bit of this, as he says, defiant optimism. Take a listen to this.
Most of the positive programs enacted by this Liberal government only happened because the NDP was holding their feet to the fire. In the next election, would you consider offering the Liberals another power-sharing minority government?
I'll say no right away. Because we're going to win the next election. We're going to be the ones. Come on now. Diagolon. Defiant optimism. I defy the odds. We're going to win because people need us to win. I genuinely mean it.
Defiant optimism. He's defiant of the reality, it appears, in this country. William, what do you make of that clip?
Yeah, I mean, I know we've legalized marijuana here in Canada. I wonder what else Mr. Singh happens to be on to have such a warped view of reality. If you look at the polling, there isn't a moment where Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats have approached winning even the slimmest minority government, let alone outright winning an election. This is a guy who has driven NDC support absolutely into the ground. He's abandoned his role as an opposition party to prop up a tired and frankly loathed Liberal government. And I think when people go to the polls, they're going to send a lot of New Democrats their walking papers. He's not going to win the next election.
He had that. Oh, we've got another guest on the show, it appears, Sue-Ann, who has just joined us on Off the Record here.
Monty agrees that, that Jagmeet Singh is a lost cause. And now people are resigning. Some of his MPs are resigning. His party has become the party of anti-Semites. You've got people who are getting up wearing keffiyehs in the legislature. And you've got people making motions to end the arms distribution to Israel. I mean, could this party do more to drive itself down in the polls? Could this party be loathed more? This is the same Jagmeet Singh who walks around wearing Rolex watches and driving, designer cars and thinks he is the champion of the working people. This guy is so disconnected from reality. It's surreal.
He had that little that pause, right, when he was sitting in his chair, because I think he realized that if he didn't say something about, wanting to actually continue his political career and wanting to win, then it would appear as though he has no use in Ottawa at all. He sits down and he's like, wait, I have to say something I have to say something about, about our political chances. So we're going to win. We're going to win. Everyone be happy, be optimistic. It seems as though, William, he knows that there is no chance for him. It seems more and more likely, actually, that this agreement with Justin Trudeau was not really about advancing some of these NDP policies, as much as it may have actually been about personally advancing himself and staying in power, because any election that would have been called without this power sharing agreement would have certainly seen not only his party get defeated, but he potentially would lose his seat.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at what's happened in some other places where we've seen power sharing agreements, the one I'm most familiar with is when David Cameron won a minority election in the UK and formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg. Well, when the next election actually happened, the new Liberal Democrats and Nick Clegg were blasted out of the water. It was really the end of them politically, not just for that election, but up until this time. It's been more than 10 years now. And I think you're going to see the same thing. The Democrats have abandoned the one key thing that they had, which was the ability to extract concessions from the Liberal government in exchange for their support on key votes. And by signing a blank check and saying, we're going to back you no matter what, election, vote after vote, issue after issue, they really said we are open to being taken advantage of, instead of having a fight for their support on issue by issue. And I think it was a terrible mistake on the part of NDP strategists, and it's going to bite them in the ass in the next election. Excuse my Western colloquialism.
Yeah, he never really got anything out of this, I don't think. He kept talking about, pharmacare and dental care, but he himself and his party never really got what they wanted. And every time he's been asked about this agreement, about not getting what he was wanting to get out of it in the first place, he has refused to do anything about it.
You're absolutely right. I mean, he could have extracted a lot of concessions from this Liberal government, ones I wouldn't personally have been supportive of ideologically, but I would have at least respected the fact that he represents a constituency of voters who believe strongly in certain things. Instead, what do we have? We have a late, watered down, incomprehensible dental care strategy that no Canadian fully knows if they're covered by or not. The beginnings of some form of pharmacare program, but that has put them in huge conflict with the provinces, who say the plan once again doesn't take into account the existing situation on the ground. And that's really about it. The only other thing he's extracted, of course, is a later election date, an election being held in 2025, when a not inconsiderable number of MPs will qualify for their generous taxpayer-funded pension plans.
Of course. And Sue-Ann, you mentioned the NDP's, ideological commitment to the Palestine issue and other very strange foreign policy positions. It doesn't even seem as though Jagmeet Singh has set his party up so that, left-wing liberal voters would end up going to his party instead of Justin Trudeau's party in the next election. It seems as though in the next election, Jagmeet Singh's not going to gain any liberal voters from Trudeau's party, and instead be left with a dwindling base in his own party.
Yeah, well, he's let them down, his party down, with respect to the, being tough on the anti-Semitic diatribe that goes on in the legislature. Heather McPherson comes to mind, and Charlie Angus, who's resigning. But, the repeated calls by her are to not just for a ceasefire, but to end the arms deal with Israel is just unconscionable. And he's never said anything, never spoken up. To me, saying nothing is, basically saying everything, that he agrees with it. He's never kept any of them in line. And the other thing is that you were talking about he hasn't made any sort of tangible deals. Look, the cost of living in Canada, gas prices, this, that, price of food, price of basic services has gone up tremendously under the Liberals. If he were a champion of the working class, as he's supposed to be, even though he wears a Rolex watch, he would be standing up and screaming from the rooftops. The only time I actually heard him screaming was to go after Galen Weston at Loblaws. Grocery prices, targeting, he's obsessed with that guy. But, overall, he's gone along with everything the Liberals done to make our life more unaffordable.
You're absolutely right. I mean, he should be tackling this issue. He should be holding the government to account for the out of control cost of living, but of course he is, and he seems more interested in other things, probably like his pension. Sue-Ann, you brought this up about you brought up the anti-Semitism issue. You recently published a great op-ed in True North. Why don't you go through what we're seeing on campuses and what you're trying to tackle here in this latest True North article of yours?
Well, I've been watching with tremendous interest and actually tremendous disdain and disappointment at what has happened on university campuses, both in the States, because I am located in the States right now, and it's, gone into Canada now. It's morphed into Canadian campuses. I've watched these kids who are kids because for the large part, I would say mommy and daddy are still paying their tuition, because who can afford to go to Columbia for $70,000 US? And I've watched them bar Jewish kids from entry onto campus. I've watched them vandalize buildings. I've watched them set up these encampments, very professional looking encampments. And then, of course, the epitome of all of this entitlement is the young lady, a PhD, a leftist PhD, who wanted humanitarian aid. She wanted food to be delivered to the building at Columbia that they had vandalized. And, the same in at McGill, they're screaming Jew hatred and nobody's doing anything. So my question the other day is, I'm watching all this, like, where are the parents in all of this? What has happened? Has the nuclear family broken down so much that parents are not either raising their kids right, to have any moral compass, to have any boundaries, to have any respect for authority? I talk about in the column about the fact that politicians have no respect. So, and schools just have become cesspools of leftist dogma. So, what should we expect? But parents have essentially handed their kids over to schools and expected them to parent. And, I'm wondering, I haven't heard any speak out. Are they watching this young lady who's asking for humanitarian aid, DoorDash essentially, to deliver some food to their building? Are they watching this, and are they ashamed? Are they embarrassed? Are they the slightest bit angry? I don't understand it.
William, what do you make of what we're seeing in the United States and now just recently at U of T?
Well, I did have to laugh at the Columbia student protester who demanded that they be delivered food. There's an expression that said the revolution will not be televised. Well, in this case, the revolution will not be catered. And if you were going to occupy a building, maybe you should have thought ahead of time about bringing snacks and drinks from home. But I think Sue-Ann makes a great point, which is obviously these kids didn't wake up one morning in the past couple weeks and decide to be rabidly pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic. It's a case of this is learned behavior from years of activist teachers, activist professors, and activist student groups allowed to present a very distorted picture of reality to these people, and parents who either through inaction or because they didn't want to have a difficult and awkward conversation with their own children, allowed this to happen. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're now seeing a rise of parental rights movements in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere, saying we're deeply concerned about what our kids are being taught or indoctrinated with in schools, the propaganda they're being fed, because frankly, they're turning into people we don't recognize. I'm sure that these kids all had loving parents and or parents who thought they were doing the best by their kids, but in reality, they've allowed their kids to become brainwashed, and it's deeply disturbing to see. The consequence, of course, being now so many Jewish students feel unwelcome and unsafe on university campuses, which is completely unacceptable. And I think it's why there are various moves now to try and address this situation, because it's becoming untenable. Certainly, anyone who has witnessed these protests cannot say they're simply protests in solidarity with the Palestinian people. The rhetoric being used is hateful, violent, and fully anti-Semitic. And I think people have said enough is enough. We cannot allow this to continue.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, it's not a story necessarily, but people have talked about this, that, you send your kid off to university and they're totally normal. They come back with totally different color hair and they've got some strange gender that doesn't really exist anywhere. right, that happens. People do get indoctrinated at these schools, and it is a big issue. I think there's also a point to make here about how universities, there has always been a tradition of protest and activism, anti-war protests and activism at universities for decades in the United States and in Canada. But there is something different about these protests. It's not the same as the anti-apartheid protests that were happening in the 80s on university campuses. There's something different here, and there's something fundamentally wrong about what they're fighting for. They have their facts wrong, but as you both have pointed out, it's being fed by professors and by media who are leading them down this path that is not righteous, like the anti-apartheid protests and perhaps the anti-war protests in Vietnam. It's completely different than what we've seen in the past.
Well, and if you go up to any of these young ladies, and I saw a wonderful clip on, I think it was on Twitter or on X, I should say, where these young ladies were asked, like, what are you doing here? Oh, I don't know. I just thought I'd come down and join the fun. And they don't know what the heck they're protesting about. They don't know what from the river to the sea means. They don't even know where Rafah is or Palestine. They couldn't point it out in a map if you asked them. And they're semi-articulate. And the other thing that I didn't mention before is that it's probably exam time is finished in Canada, but certainly in the States, they're going through exams. And do the parents not care that their kids are finishing the term? Or, instead of sitting out in tents, shouldn't they be writing their exams? And the whole thing about not allowing Jewish students into the university, that's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And parents watching this, I'm watching it on TV, and I'm outraged. And parents watching this, they're thinking, my little darling's doing this. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're afraid of their little darling. I don't know.
Yeah, William, what do you make of those comments?
Well, I think it'd be an interesting exercise to go onto these campus protests and ask them to identify what the name of the river is and what the name of the sea is. And maybe as a precursor to having a position on this conflict, you should have to be able to answer some basic questions about it. I bet we'd find a lot of them wouldn't be able to articulate either of those things. But no, I completely agree with Sue-Ann's point that if you're a Jewish student who's paid for these classes and who wants to get an elite post-secondary education, and now you're being denied the right to enter buildings or move certain places on campus, it's completely unacceptable. Protest movements are protected, but your rights infringing on other people's rights have to come up against some reasonable limits. And I think in the case of these protests, when you see them occupying buildings, committing acts of violence, calling for hatred and violence against different groups and religions, I think all of that combined means they've crossed that line beyond legitimate peaceful protesting into something far darker and far more disturbing.
Right, and the federal government has, in Canada, they've displayed a willingness to treat protests differently depending on the cause that is being protested. Of course, we've seen protests just remove the university protests, these pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine protests, remove that from the university. Let's talk about the protests outside of these synagogues, outside of religious places of worship. Well, that was treated a completely different way than a peaceful protest in Ottawa over vaccine mandates. That's one point I want to raise. Another point I want to raise, going back to the tradition of protests at universities. In these protests in the past, in decades past, I don't think the majority of people involved in these protests were trying to cover their faces, wearing masks and masking their identity. It seems, Sue-Ann, that you talk about how parents might be ashamed of seeing their children involved in these protests. Maybe some of these people, they don't want to be seen in the protests themselves, but they want to be a part of the movement. They're maybe afraid to show their own identity for a cause they apparently seem so worthy to stand up for.
Definitely. I think, let's talk about Toronto and the rules around not masking yourself at protests. Well, that doesn't seem to have been upheld. So we still have them wearing these masks and the keffiyehs wrapped around their heads. And, either they're ashamed or they think that if they cover their faces, they won't be arrested because they can't be identified. But let's just say they're fooling themselves.
Yeah. And I want to open this aspect up just to a broader conversation. It's in the news now, and there have been Canadian conservative commentators and American conservative commentators talking about this. The United States, they just passed a piece of legislation which tackles anti-Semitism. Now, a lot of people are saying that instead of enforcing the laws that are already on the books to clear out these protests, the government has now moved to actually tighten free speech rules around ability to criticize Israel, for example. I want to get your opinions, both of you, on just the idea of adding in new legislation to combat anti-Semitism rather than just clearing out the protests with the additional laws in place. William, why don't I start with you?
I mean, I think everybody has to be extremely careful when we start passing laws that further limit any of our fundamental freedoms. I think what we're seeing in the case of the United States is a reaction to the apparent failure of institutions, of law enforcement, of universities to actually do something meaningful about these protests. They're looking at these protesters getting away with everything they have been and saying, well, look, we don't think this is acceptable. We want to strengthen the toolbox in order to be able to take more direct action on it. I think there is a lot of risk when you start to say certain things are fall under that restricted category, or you take away fundamental freedoms of speech or assembly. But I think it just reflects the desperation so many feel in saying, why can't we do something about this? Why can't we clear out some of these encampments? Why can't we stop people from making violent and hateful statements? Why can't we arrest people for breaking the law? So, you're seeing those two forces come up against each other, a desire to have freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of assembly, and saying, but also we've crossed the line into far darker things and we need to take fundamental action against them.
Sue-Ann, what do you think about this combating between existing laws and wanting to add more laws into place?
Well, I agree with William. It's all a result of not handling the laws they have right now. I'll give you an example. In Toronto, for years and years and years, I've covered the Al-Quds protest. That is virulently anti-Semitic. They march down the streets of Toronto illegally. They don't have a permit. They're screaming basically death to Jews. We have hate laws in Canada. All the politicians have talked about clamping down on them, but they don't arrest them. They don't invoke the hate laws. I think the police have a really hard time understanding the hate laws and how to use them. And I don't blame them entirely because the politicians send them mixed messages. So, I mean, putting more legislation in place really, to me, is just smoke and mirrors. Use the laws you have now. Colombia is a perfect example. They took 2 hours to clear out that encampment once they brought the police in. 2 hours. These tough talking kids, fell like jello. Their spines melted like jello. They, and for 2 weeks they were threatening. For 2 weeks they were causing chaos and mayhem. I'm a believer of tough love, but our whole society has become like spines of jello. We don't deal with crime. We don't deal with drug dealing. We don't deal with all the things that make our society, give us a quality of life. And this is just another example of not invoking the laws they already have and using a little tough love. I mean, like that president of Colombia, what is wrong with her? She was so afraid to get rid of these people, even though it was playing out on the screens of all our televisions, and it was making that Ivy League school look terrible.
Right. And I wish there was a good transition for this, but there really isn't. We have to move on to our next story here. And for whatever reason, the Liberals and the legacy media have refused to let go of this story, this Diagolon story, trying to somehow paint Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party as though they're secretly collaborating with the dangerous far right. Let's throw up another article about this story if we have it. And there we go. Jeremy Mackenzie, who we spoke about on this show last week, he, of course, is credited as being the founder of Diagolon. In reality, Diagolon is not even actually a group. We know that from the Hategate reporting. They don't meet the definition of a group, let alone a dangerous far-right militia, as some have tried to paint them as, but that has been the line from Anti-Hate Network. He went on, this story hasn't gone away, and so he actually went on, I think it was with Viva Frei, and he released a statement saying that he is not connected with the Conservative Party. He is not connected with Pierre Poilievre. In fact, anyone who follows the rhetoric of the group and the people that watch Jeremy Mackenzie know that he is by no means a fan of Pierre Poilievre. In fact, it seems as though they seem to attack Pierre Poilievre as much, if not more, than they attack Justin Trudeau. But of course, that has not stopped the Liberals and the media from staying on this story relentlessly. They seem desperate, William, to do whatever they can to try to paint Pierre Poilievre as someone he is clearly not.
You're absolutely right. And as far as I can tell, Diagolon is like three people. It's
Right.
three people who are very unhappy about a lot of different things. And they seem equally as unhappy about Pierre Poilievre as they do about Justin Trudeau. So why the Liberals seem to think that this this trio of malcontents is somehow a fundamental threat to our civilization, well, they're going to have to explain it to me again. I don't understand. I would say what it's showing is, frankly, the desperation on the part of the Liberal government. They put all of their effort into this 2024 budget, into the affordability and housing announcements that they touted for weeks leading up to the budget, and should be right now doing a full court press selling to Canadians how their lives would be better off with this Liberal budget and therefore under the Liberal government. The fact that they're not shows just how much of a flop this budget has been for them. And so now they're reverting to type. Desperate accusations from Pierre Poilievre using the term wacko is the end of parliamentary democracy, to Diagolon is a secret Pierre Poilievre militia that's going to destroy Canada. I haven't checked Twitter or X lately. Maybe there's a new one, but it's absurd. And I think the fact that they aren't even denting Pierre's popularity reflects just how much Canadians have tuned out the Liberal government and Prime Minister Trudeau.
Sue-Ann, what do you make of these desperate attempts, these desperate attacks against Pierre Poilievre?
Well, the polls say everything. Pierre Poilievre is way up in the polls. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but it's actually quite funny because, the last 6 months, for example, have not been kind to Justin Trudeau. People are seeing through. He's not handled the Palestinian-Israeli conflict issue, the rise in anti-Semitism. He said they were all peaceful protesters, drug issues. Now we have premiers saying that there's been a huge, they don't agree with safe injection sites. And this is all coming back to haunt him. And, the expression, if you throw enough spaghetti against the wall, you hope it will stick. But nothing's sticking. It's very greasy spaghetti. So it keeps falling off the wall. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this, but it's kindergarten time, the way they talk. I mean, the whole thing about throwing Pierre Poilievre out of Parliament the other day was just, they're like little children.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a series of attacks they've tried to make work against Pierre Poilievre. Obviously, none of it has worked. Why don't we throw up the polling that our colleague Cosmin Georgia was able to pull from? Basically, it's actually been following since 2022, since June of 2022. At the end here, you can see that this from April 29th to the 24th, Poilievre's polling has actually increased, and these Diagolon smears against Poilievre and the Conservatives began right at that time. So none of this is actually working for them. And there's a couple of things going on here which I find very interesting. I made this point in my show that we released yesterday about how these attempts by the Liberals to make Diagolon seem bigger and scarier and more important than they actually are only really serve to do two things. One, it actually will get more attention to a group they supposedly feel as though is some dangerous right-wing militia. People are going to actually see this and look into it. The other thing that I think is going on here is that they want Diagolon to be a bigger force than it is because they want to have the weapon to attack Conservatives with. They need to have a Canadian version of the Proud Boys, which they can use to silence Conservatives and silence Conservatives into submission. It benefits them, and I don't think it's going to work for them, but they're obviously, in my opinion, trying to do that. They're trying to create something out of nothing here and create something that they can use for many years to attack conservatives over. Let me know, William, as someone who's worked in this industry, inside politics, if you think that I'm onto something here, or if you think I'm a little off.
No, I mean, it's they're trying to change the channel away from their own dismal performance and their own low popularity. The problem is what they're trying to change the channel to is just so unconvincing. You know, the idea that this Diagolon group is anything other than a small group of, you know, some would say crackpots, others would say malcontents, the grumpy people who they are, poses some sort of threat to Canada is absolutely ludicrous. In the same way that, you know, when Alex Jones says he likes Pierre Poilievre, suddenly that represents some sort of fundamental threat to Canada. And I'll bet you most of the people in Canada would have to Google who Alex Jones is to have any idea of what the Liberals are talking about. These are symptoms of a government that doesn't have a policy agenda that can deal with the issues and with the concerns that ordinary Canadians have. They're offside on so many things like the carbon tax, which is widely unpopular. They're soft on crime, soft on drug addiction agenda, which is really out of step with Canadians, especially those in cities and smaller towns. And so instead of trying to present policy ideas, they're down to this. They're throwing the muck, and the muck they have is just so unconvincing that I don't think you're going to see any movement in the polls except for an increase in conservative support and an ongoing decrease in Liberal.
And this is despite the attempts by the trained media seals to, speak up and make the most ludicrous comments. I could think of a few names, but I won't, single out anybody. But that panel with Rosie Barton, it's just ridiculous that they go on and on and on, and it's people are tuning out this sort of thing. They know that Justin Trudeau is bailing these people out, and they know that the CBC is over granted, getting too much money, and they just don't believe these kind of things anymore. The average person, I should say.
I almost feel bad for the talking heads on the CBC who have to go with these liberal policy communications tactics. They just it must be so difficult to try to make news out of nothing like that. All right, everyone. Well, just remember, everything you heard was off the record. Well, a few hiccups in the hosting of the show, but I think we managed to make it through.
No, I think you did. I think you did really well, actually.
You did great, and Monty agrees. He's come back to see how we finished. So,
we could have given him the last word. As a matter of fact,
he's a vowed conservative dachshund.